we're going to talk about something profound, something that has haunted humanity since the moment we became conscious enough to ask the question, when did death enter the world? When did we become mortal? The ancient Sumerians, writing on clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, had an answer. They told a story, fragmented across dozens of tablets, about the moment mortality became the defining characteristic of human existence. They wrote about gods who created us, gods who ordained our deaths, and gods who tried to save us from annihilation. These aren't just ancient myths disconnected from reality. These are sophisticated theological texts that grapple with fundamental questions about human nature, questions we still ask today. Why do we die? What happens after death? Is there any way to escape mortality? How do we find meaning in a life that we know will end? The Sumerians didn't have our scientific understanding of biology or medicine, but they had something we often lack today, a coherent cosmological framework that explained death's place in the universe. They knew exactly when and why death entered the world because their priests and scribes had recorded the divine decrees on imperishable clay. Tonight we're going to explore those tablets, those ancient records that preserve humanity's oldest attempt to understand mortality. We'll journey through the creation myths that establish death as part of human nature from the very beginning. We'll examine the flood stories that explain how death became more active, more present in daily life. We'll follow the hero Gilgamesh on his desperate quest for immortality and his eventual acceptance that death cannot be conquered, only transcended through legacy. And we'll discover what these 4,000-year-old texts can teach us about living meaningfully in the face of our own mortality. The story begins not with death, but with discovery. In the mid-19th century, archaeologists working in what is now modern Iraq began unearthing something extraordinary. Beneath layers of sand and centuries of forgetting, they found the ruins of ancient cities, places with names that would soon become legendary. Nineveh, Babylon, Nippur. These weren't just archaeological sites. They were the remnants of Sumer, one of humanity's first great civilizations, a culture that flourished in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from around 5,000 years ago. The expeditions to these ancient sites were often funded by Western institutions, hoping to find physical evidence that would corroborate biblical narratives. The 19th century saw an unprecedented rise in critical biblical scholarship, questioning long-held beliefs about Scripture's divine origin and historical accuracy. Museums and universities poured resources into Mesopotamian archaeology, seeking artifacts that would either validate or challenge traditional religious accounts. What they found exceeded anyone's expectations, not confirmation of biblical stories, but the sources those stories are drawn from. Older versions of creation myths and flood narratives that predated the Bible by more than a millennium. The excavations themselves were adventurous undertakings, requiring months of travel to remote locations, negotiations with local authorities, and backbreaking labor in extreme heat. Archaeologists like Austin Henry Layard, Hormuzd Rassam, and Robert Calderway spent years carefully excavating tells, the artificial hills formed by centuries of human habitation. Layer by layer, they uncovered the remains of palaces, temples, houses, and workshops. But most importantly, they found libraries, vast collections of clay tablets that had been carefully archived by ancient scribes. What made these ruins truly remarkable wasn't just their age or their architecture, it was what they contained. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, each one covered in strange wedge-shaped marks pressed into the soft clay before it was baked hard. These marks, called cuneiform, represented one of the world's earliest writing systems. When scholars finally cracked the code and began translating these ancient texts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they discovered something astonishing. These tablets weren't just administrative records or lists of grain stores, though there were plenty of those. They contained stories, myths, religious texts, and philosophical musings that predated the Bible by more than 1,000 years. The decipherment of cuneiform was itself an epic story of scholarly dedication. The Rosetta Stone model of using a multilingual inscription to crack an unknown script worked for some aspects of Mesopotamian writing, but cuneiform presented unique challenges. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics with their recognizable pictorial elements, cuneiform symbols were abstract wedge combinations that gave no obvious clues to their meaning. Scholars like Georg Friedrich Grotefend and Henry Rawlinson spent decades puzzling over inscriptions, building vocabularies sign by sign, testing theories against new discoveries, gradually reconstructing a dead language that hadn't been spoken in over 2,000 years. The breakthrough came through royal inscriptions, especially the trilingual Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in Persia. This massive text, proclaiming the deeds of the Persian king Darius in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian, provided the key to understanding Akkadian cuneiform. Once that language was unlocked, scholars could work backwards to its predecessor, Sumerian, a language unlike any other known tongue, grammatically and linguistically isolated. The Sumerians called themselves the Black-Headed People, and their language was utterly unique, unrelated to the Semitic languages of their Akkadian and Babylonian successors. As translations progressed, the richness of Mesopotamian literature became apparent. There were law codes, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, medical texts, business contracts, personal letters, royal annals, religious hymns, and most remarkably, elaborate mythological narratives that explored the deepest questions of human existence. Among these were creation stories, tales of gods and heroes, explanations of how the world came to be and humanity's place within it. And woven through all of these narratives was a consistent theme, a meditation on mortality that revealed something profound about how the Sumerians understood death. Among these discoveries were tablets that told the story of creation, of floods, of gods and heroes. But woven through all of these narratives was a consistent theme, a meditation on mortality that revealed something profound about how the Sumerians understood death. They didn't see death as a punishment for sin, as later traditions would. They didn't view it as an accident or a cosmic mistake. According to their texts, death was ordained for humanity from the very moment of our creation. It was built into us deliberately, a fundamental part of what makes us human rather than divine. This theological position appears explicitly in multiple texts. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete Mesopotamian creation myths, states clearly that when the gods created humanity, they specifically decreed that humans would be mortal. The epic's protagonist, whose name literally means exceedingly wise, cannot escape this decree despite his wisdom and divine favor. The death of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian poem describing the legendary king's demise, has the gods explained to Gilgamesh that from the day humanity was created, death was ordained for them. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself, perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian text, builds its entire narrative around the hero's futile attempt to escape the mortality that was decreed at creation. The tablets tell us that when the gods created humanity, they mixed clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god. This gave humans a dual nature, part earthly and part divine. But the gods also made a crucial decision in that moment of creation. They decreed that while gods would live forever, humans would not. Death was our destiny, our shimtu, a word that appears again and again in Sumerian texts. It means fate, but specifically the fate that was decreed for us before we even existed. Mortality wasn't something that happened to humanity. It was written into the very blueprint of our being. The story begins not with death, but with discovery. In the mid-19th century, archaeologists working in what is now modern Iraq began unearthing something extraordinary. Beneath layers of sand and centuries of forgetting, they found the ruins of ancient cities, places with names that would soon become legendary: Nineveh, Babylon, Nippur. These weren't just archaeological sites. They were the remnants of Sumer, one of humanity's first great civilizations, a culture that flourished in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from around 5,000 years ago. What made these ruins truly remarkable wasn't just their age or their architecture, it was what they contained. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, each one covered in strange wedge-shaped marks pressed into the soft clay before it was baked hard. These marks, called cuneiform, represented one of the world's earliest writing systems. When scholars finally cracked the code, and began translating these ancient texts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they discovered something astonishing. These tablets weren't just administrative records or lists of grain stores, though there were plenty of those. They contained stories, myths, religious texts, and philosophical musings that predated the Bible by more than 1,000 years. Among these discoveries were tablets that told the story of creation, of floods, of gods, and heroes. But woven through all of these narratives was a consistent theme, a meditation on mortality that revealed something profound about how the Sumerians understood death. They didn't see death as a punishment for sin, as later traditions would. They didn't view it as an accident or a cosmic mistake. According to their texts, death was ordained for humanity from the very moment of our creation. It was built into us deliberately, a fundamental part of what makes us human rather than divine. The tablets tell us that when the gods created humanity, they mixed clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god. This gave humans a dual nature, part earthly and part divine. But the gods also made a crucial decision in that moment of creation. They decreed that while gods would live forever, humans would not. Death was our destiny, our shimtu, a word that appears again and again in Sumerian texts. It means fate, but specifically the fate that was decreed for us before we even existed. Mortality wasn't something that happened to humanity. It was written into the very blueprint of our being. This understanding of death permeates Sumerian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature, is fundamentally about a king's desperate attempt to escape mortality and his eventual acceptance that death defines what it means to be human. The Atrahasis epic tells the story of humanity's creation and near destruction, explaining why death exists and why it's necessary. The Death of Gilgamesh, another Sumerian poem, describes the legendary king's journey to the underworld and his judgment by the gods. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how death entered the world according to the Sumerians, we need to start at the beginning, with their cosmology, their understanding of how the universe came to be, and how humanity fits into the grand design of the gods. The Sumerian worldview was complex, sophisticated, and in many ways, surprisingly modern in its attempt to explain the fundamental questions of existence. Let's step back to the moment before creation, to the primordial waters where everything begins. In the beginning, according to Sumerian myth, there was Namu, the primeval sea. She was the mother of all, existing alone in the void before time had meaning. From Namu came the first separation, the division of heaven and earth. She gave birth to An, the sky, and Kai, the earth. These two cosmic forces then mated, and from their union came Enlil, the god of wind, storm, and air. Enlil was powerful, perhaps more powerful than his parents, and he performed the first great act of creation. He separated An from Kai, pushing the sky upward and holding the earth down below, creating the space between where life could exist. This separation created the world as the Sumerians knew it. The earth became a flat disk surrounded by the cosmic ocean, with the dome of heaven arching above. Beneath the earth lay the Kur, the underworld, a dark realm where the dead would eventually go. The Sumerians imagined the sky as a series of domes, usually 3 but sometimes 7, each made of a different precious stone. The lowest dome was jasper, home to the stars. The middle dome was Sagalmut stone, dwelling place of the Agigi gods. The highest dome was the realm of An himself, unreachable and eternal. The pantheon that ruled this cosmos was vast and complex. At its head was An, though he gradually became a more distant figure, representing the concept of divine authority rather than actively intervening in worldly affairs. The real power lay with Enlil, the king of the gods, who held the tablets of destiny. These tablets were sacred objects that decreed the fate of both gods and humans. Whoever possessed them had ultimate authority over the cosmos. Enlil wielded this power from his temple in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, a city considered to be the very meeting point between heaven and earth. But Enlil wasn't the only powerful deity. There was also Enki, known in Akkadian as Ea, the god of wisdom, magic, and the subterranean freshwater ocean called the Abzu. Enki was clever, crafty, a trickster god who often acted as humanity's protector and benefactor. While Enlil represented authority and order, sometimes harsh and unyielding, Enki represented wisdom and compassion, finding creative solutions to impossible problems. This dynamic between the two gods would prove crucial to humanity's survival. The pantheon also included Ninhursag, the mother goddess who helped create humanity. There was Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love, war and fertility, whose descent to the underworld became one of Sumer's most famous myths. Utu, the sun god, brought light and justice. Nanna, the moon god, measured time with his changing phases. Ereshkigal ruled the underworld alongside her consort Nagal, the god of death and plague. Each deity had specific responsibilities, domains and relationships with the others, creating a divine bureaucracy that mirrored Sumerian society itself. The cosmic order was maintained through the Mi, sacred decrees or divine powers that governed everything from kingship to agriculture, from music to warfare. The gods possessed these Mi and could bestow them upon humans or withhold them. Recent scholarship has shown that these Mi were actually rituals whose proper performance was essential to Mesopotamian culture. The gods didn't just rule through raw power, but through knowledge of the correct way to do things, the proper order of the universe. And death itself was part of this divine order. The Sumerians believed that everything had its proper place, its destiny. The stars followed their ordained paths across the sky. The rivers flooded at their appointed times. Cities rose where the gods decreed they should rise, and humans, created for a specific purpose, followed their ordained path from birth to death to the afterlife. This worldview didn't see randomness or chaos in the universe. Everything happened according to divine will, according to fate. When the texts say that Enki ordained death for humanity from our inception, they mean that mortality was woven into the fundamental structure of reality, as certain as the rising of the sun or the changing of seasons. Understanding this cosmology is essential to understanding the Sumerian view of death. They didn't see it as something that went wrong, as a punishment or a curse. It was simply the way things were meant to be. The question wasn't why do we die, but rather, why were we created mortal when the gods are immortal? And that question brings us to the story of humanity's creation, a tale preserved in several different texts but most completely in the Atrahasis epic. The story of how humanity came to be is told most fully in the Atrahasis epic, an 18th century BCE Babylonian text that draws on much older Sumerian sources. The epic's name comes from its hero Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, but before we meet him, we need to understand why humans were created in the first place. The answer, according to the tablets, is labor. The gods created humans to work for them, to relieve them of toil. This wasn't an arbitrary decision. It came from a crisis in the divine realm itself, a rebellion that threatened the very order of the cosmos. In the beginning, the gods had to work. The universe didn't maintain itself. The great gods, the Anunnaki, assigned tasks to the lesser gods, the Igigi. These younger deities had to dig out canals, dredge rivers, clear fields and maintain the infrastructure of the cosmos. For 3,600 years, the Igigi laboured without complaint. But then something broke. The work was too hard, the burden too great. The Igigi began to grumble, then to complain openly, and finally they rebelled. They burned their tools, surrounded Enlil's dwelling at night, and demanded an end to their endless toil. Enlil, awakened by the commotion, was furious. He wanted to punish the rebellious gods, to crush their uprising with force. But Enki, the wise counselor, proposed a different solution. Why not create new beings, creatures who could take over the labor from the gods? They would be mortal, yes, but capable of the work that the gods found so burdensome. The Council of Gods agreed, and the task of creation was given to Enki and the mother goddess, known in different texts as Ninhursag, Nintu, Beletili, or Mami. But creating life required sacrifice. The gods couldn't make something from nothing. They needed raw materials that contained both earthly substance and divine essence. So a god had to die. The texts tell us his name was Weilu, though some versions call him Ilawela or Gesh-tu-A. He's described as a god who had temu, meaning understanding or intelligence. This divine quality was essential because the new creatures needed to be intelligent enough to serve the gods effectively. Wheelu volunteered or was chosen for this sacrifice, understanding that his death would give rise to something new. The ritual of creation was solemn and deliberate. On the 1st, 7th and 15th days of the month, purification rites were performed. Then Wheelu was slaughtered and his blood was collected. Enki instructed Ninhursag to mix this divine blood with clay from the earth. The clay represented the mortal, earthly nature of the new beings, while the blood provided the divine spark, the intelligence and spirit that would animate them. 14 lumps of this mixture were prepared, 7 to become men and 7 to become women. Ninhursag, along with 14 birth goddesses, pinched and shaped the clay and blood mixture, forming the first human bodies. Then Enki breathed into them, and they opened their eyes. The texts describe this moment with a kind of wonder. These new creatures, neither fully god nor fully animal, looked at each other and at their creators. They were paired male and female, and from them would come all the generations of humanity. The gods rejoiced. Their labour was ended. Humans would now dig the canals, plough the fields, tend the livestock and offer sacrifices to sustain the gods. A great feast was held to celebrate this achievement. An, Enlil and Enki roasted holy goats and drank beer. But even in this moment of celebration, something crucial was decided, something that would define human existence forever. The gods, in their wisdom, or perhaps their necessity, decreed that these new creatures would not live forever. They would age, weaken, and die. This decision is mentioned almost casually in some texts, but its implications are profound. The Mesopotamians had no concept of physical resurrection or reincarnation. Rather, as the tablets state clearly, Enki ordained death for humans from their very inception. Mortality defined the fundamental human condition. It was described as our destiny, our Shimtu. The most common euphemism for dying in Mesopotamian texts is to go to one's fate. Death wasn't something that happened to you unexpectedly. It was the fate that had been waiting for you since before you were born. Why did the gods make this choice? The texts don't provide a simple answer, but we can infer some reasoning from the myths. First, immortality was a divine prerogative. If humans lived forever, the distinction between gods and mortals would blur. The cosmic order depended on this separation. Gods were eternal, humans were temporary. This hierarchy was fundamental to Sumerian theology. Second, as we'll see, the gods eventually realized that human mortality served a practical purpose. It prevented overpopulation and the chaos that came with it. But the decision to make humans mortal wasn't just about practicality or divine privilege. It was also about the nature of existence itself. The Sumerians believed that death gave meaning to life. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll explore more deeply later, argues that our mortality makes our achievements meaningful, our relationships precious, our time valuable. An immortal being has no urgency, no reason to create or strive or love with the intensity that mortals do. In this view, death isn't just what kills us, it's what makes us truly alive. When humans were created from clay and divine blood, they received not just physical bodies but also something the Sumerians called the atemu, which scholars often translate as ghost or spirit. This wasn't exactly a soul in the Christian sense. The Mesopotamians didn't have a strict body-soul dualism. The atemu was closely connected to the physical body, even after death. When Wheelu was slaughtered to create humanity, the text uses wordplay to explain that his temu, his understanding, became the atemu that all humans possess. This divine quality, this spark of intelligence from a dead god's blood, was what would survive physical death and journey to the underworld. The creation story establishes several fundamental truths about human nature, according to Sumerian thought. We are made from both earth and heaven, mortal clay and immortal blood. We contain divine intelligence but earthly limitations. We are created to serve, but we also possess free will and the capacity for greatness. And we are, from our very first breath, marked for death. The gods built mortality into us as deliberately as they gave us hands and eyes. This wasn't a curse or a punishment. It was simply part of the design, as essential to being human as being made from clay. The tablets that tell this story were copied and recopied for thousands of years, from the Sumerian originals through Akkadian and Babylonian versions, all the way to the Library of Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE. The story evolved, details changed, but the core remained the same. Humanity was created to work for the gods, and humanity was created mortal. These two facts defined our existence, and as we'll see, this mortality would soon become not just an individual fate, but a cosmic problem that threatened the very survival of our species. Now we come to the moment when death, which had been ordained from humanity's creation, becomes fully manifest in the world. The tablets describe a period after creation when humans multiplied across the earth. They filled the cities that the gods had established, places like Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. These weren't just mythological places but actual Sumerian cities, and by naming them, the tablets ground this cosmic story in geographic reality. The people lived, worked, had children, and yes, they died, just as Enki had decreed. But something unexpected happened. There were too many of them. The Atrahasis. Epic describes what happened next with brutal clarity. The land was bellowing like a bull. The noise of humanity disturbed the gods. Specifically, it disturbed Enlil, the king of the gods, who could not sleep because of the racket that humans made. The text is quite specific about this. It wasn't that humans were sinful or wicked, though later traditions would add that element. They were simply too numerous and too loud. Their very existence, their voices, their activities, the sound of life itself, became unbearable to the god who ruled over them. After 1,200 years of this disturbance, Enlil decided to act. He couldn't tolerate the noise any longer. So he brought a plague upon humanity, sending Namtar, the god of pestilence, to reduce their numbers through disease. The plague was devastating. People sickened and died in vast numbers, but Atrahasis, the hero of the epic, was wise and knew how to communicate with the gods. He turned to his patron deity, Enki, who had created humanity in the first place. Enki advised Atrahasis to stop worshipping all the gods and instead focus all offerings on Namtar himself. This strategy worked. Namtar, flattered by the exclusive attention and offerings, lifted the plague. Humanity recovered and multiplied once more. Another 1,200 years passed, and again the noise became too much for Enlil to bear. This time he sent a drought, commanding Eidad, the god of rain and storms, to withhold water from the earth. The drought was terrible. Rivers dried up, crops failed, famine spread across the land. The tablets describe children being sold for grain, families resorting to cannibalism to survive. It was meant to be humanity's end, death by slow starvation. But again, Atrahasis consulted with Enki, and again Enki provided a solution. Atrahasis was told to offer prayers and sacrifices exclusively to Adad. The rain god, moved by the devotion shown to him alone, broke ranks with the other gods and sent rain. The drought ended, and humanity survived and grew numerous once more. You can see the pattern forming. Enlil, disturbed by human noise and overpopulation, tries to reduce humanity's numbers. Enki, compassionate toward his creations, finds loopholes and workarounds to save them. This conflict between the two great gods reflects different aspects of divine nature and different approaches to the problem of mortality. Enlil sees humans as a nuisance, something to be controlled, and if necessary, eliminated. Enki sees them as his handiwork, beings worthy of preservation and protection. But Enlil wasn't stupid. He recognized what was happening, that his plans were being subverted by Enki's clever interventions. So when another 1,200 years had passed and the noise had become unbearable once more, Enlil convened a council of all the gods. This time he proposed a final solution. No more plagues that could be lifted, no more droughts that could be ended with rain. He would send a flood, a complete annihilation of humanity, and he would make all the gods swear an oath not to interfere. Even Enki would be bound by this oath, prevented from warning humans or helping them escape. The council agreed. The tablets describe how Enlil declared a general embargo on all of nature's gifts to humanity, and would guard the heavens, Enlil the earth, and Enki the waters beneath the earth, making sure no nourishment reached the human race. This wasn't just a drought. This was a coordinated divine assault meant to starve humanity into extinction before the final blow of the flood. The texts describe the horror that followed. For 6 years, the famine intensified. People ate grass, then leather, then finally each other. When the 6th year arrived, they served up a daughter for a meal, served up a son for food. It's one of the most harrowing passages in ancient literature, but Enki, bound by his oath not to directly warn humans, found another loophole. He couldn't speak to Atrahasis directly, but he could speak to a wall, and if Atrahasis happened to be on the other side of that wall listening, well, that wasn't Enki's fault. The tablets preserve this moment with a kind of grim humour. Enki addresses the wall, telling it about the coming flood and instructing it to inform its listener to build a boat, to tear down his house and construct a vessel, to bring aboard the seed of all living things. Atrahasis, listening through the wall, understood. He began to build. The boat was enormous, carefully specified in the texts with exact dimensions. It had to be strong enough to withstand the coming deluge, large enough to hold not just Atrahasis and his family, but also animals and craftspeople. Everyone and everything needed to restart civilization after the flood. As Atrahasis built, his neighbours mocked him. Why was he constructing a boat when there was no water? But he continued, following Enki's instructions precisely, sealing the vessel with bitumen so it would be watertight. Then the flood came. The texts describe it with terrifying vividness. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged. The huge boat was tossed about on the great waters. The noise of the flood itself drowned out everything, a cosmic roar as the gods unleashed water from above and below, from the sky and from the Abzu, the subterranean ocean. All of humanity perished, except for those in the boat. The gods had finally succeeded in silencing the noise that disturbed them, but in doing so they discovered something they hadn't anticipated. When the flood ended and the waters receded, the gods found themselves in a predicament. Without humans to offer sacrifices, they had no food. The tablets describe them gathering like flies over Atrahasis' sacrifice when he finally emerged from the boat and made offerings to thank the gods for his survival. They were hungry, desperate, and suddenly realized that they needed humans as much as humans needed them. Enlil was furious when he discovered that someone had survived, knowing immediately that Enki must have found a way around his oath. But Enki argued eloquently for humanity's preservation. He pointed out the injustice of destroying all humans for the sins or noise of a few. He noted that the gods could have used other methods to control population, methods less extreme than total annihilation, and most importantly, he proposed a permanent solution to the overpopulation problem, one that would prevent the crisis from ever happening again. Instead of trying to wipe out humanity periodically, why not build controls into human reproduction itself? The solution Enki proposed, with the help of the birth goddess Nintu, was to make death more effective. Up until this point, humans had died when Enki decreed they should, but apparently not frequently enough to prevent overpopulation. So new measures were instituted. Some women would be barren, unable to bear children at all. Certain classes of priestesses would be forbidden from having offspring. Most significantly, infant mortality would become common. The text mentions a demon called Padagitu, who would snatch babies from their mothers' laps. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, but a population control mechanism, ensuring that humanity would never again grow so numerous that their noise disturbed the gods. The flood story in Atrahasis, which parallels the Sumerian flood myth in the Eridu Genesis and later appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, marks a turning point in the relationship between gods and humans. Before the flood, death was ordained but apparently not aggressive enough in its culling of humanity. After the flood, death became more active, more present in human life from birth onward. The tablets are explicit about this. Enki speaks to Nintu, telling her to establish death for all peoples, From now on, humans would be familiarized with suffering and death from birth. Their lifespan would be severely limited, in biblical terms eventually set at 120 years, though few would live even that long. This is the moment when death truly entered the world in its fullest manifestation, not just as an eventual end, but as a constant presence throughout life. Babies would die, children would sicken, young people would fall in battles or to disease, the elderly would wither and fail. No one was exempt. Death became democratized, striking anyone at any time, though all would eventually face it. The tablets describe this with a kind of sad acceptance. It wasn't punishment. It was simply the new order of things, the price of humanity's continued existence. We could live, but only if we accepted that we would also die, often and in large numbers. The Mesopotamian understanding of mortality after the flood differs significantly from later religious traditions. There's no concept of original sin here, no fall from grace in a garden. Humans didn't do anything wrong to deserve death. They simply existed in too great a number, made too much noise, disturbed the cosmic order. Death was the solution to this problem, a practical measure to keep humanity in check. This practical, almost bureaucratic approach to mortality might seem cold to modern readers, but it reflects a Sumerian worldview that saw the gods as fundamentally different from humans, with different needs and different priorities. The tablets also make clear that this arrangement, however harsh, was better than the alternative. Complete annihilation, the total destruction of humanity, was worse than a shorter lifespan and higher infant mortality. Enki's compromise saved the species while addressing Enlil's legitimate concern about overpopulation and noise. In this sense, death became not just humanity's curse, but also our salvation. It's what allowed us to continue existing at all. Without death doing its work, Enlil would have eventually found another way to eliminate us entirely. This theme of death as both curse and necessity runs through Sumerian literature. It's not celebrated, but it's not entirely mourned either. It simply is, part of the fundamental structure of reality. The Sumerians didn't waste time wishing they were immortal. They knew the gods had decreed otherwise. Instead, their literature focuses on how to live well within the bounds of mortality, how to make meaning in the face of death, how to be remembered after you're gone. These questions would find their fullest expression in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they're present in almost every Sumerian text that touches on human existence. The flood story also establishes another crucial aspect of Sumerian theology regarding death. Humans die, but the gods remember. Atrahasis and his wife were granted immortality as a reward for preserving life through the flood. In some versions, he's taken to a distant paradise called Dilmun to live forever. This exception proves the rule. Immortality is possible, but only through divine gift, not human achievement. You can't earn it through good deeds or wisdom or strength. You can only receive it if the gods choose to bestow it, and they almost never do. Atrahasis is unique, his name living on through the ages in the epic that bears it, but his immortality sets him apart from all other humans, making him more god than man. As we continue through the tablets, we'll see how this understanding of death shaped every aspect of Sumerian culture, from their religious practices to their literature, from their view of the afterlife to their concept of what makes life meaningful. But for now, we need to understand what happened to humans after death, where they went, what their existence was like in the land from which no traveller returns. The Sumerians called it the Kur, and their descriptions of it reveal much about how they understood the relationship between life and death. The Sumerian underworld, the Kur, was not a place of punishment or reward. It wasn't heaven or hell. It was simply where everyone went when they died, regardless of how they had lived. Kings and slaves, heroes and cowards, the pious and the wicked, all descended to the same dark realm beneath the earth. This democratic approach to the afterlife reflects the Sumerian view that death was a universal fate, decreed by the gods for all humanity. What distinguished people wasn't whether they died, everyone did, but how they were remembered by the living, and how well their funerary rites were performed. The Kur was described as a dark place, a land of no return, a house which none leave who enter. The texts paint it as gloomy and dusty. with bolts on its doors to ensure that no one could escape back to the world of the living. It wasn't torture, but it wasn't pleasant either. The dead existed there as shadows of their former selves, sustained by whatever offerings their living relatives made to them. Without these offerings, without the proper burial rites and regular remembrance, a spirit could become restless and dangerous, a Giddim or a Temu that might haunt the living. The ruler of this realm was Ereshkigal, the goddess of death and the underworld. She was often described as the older sister of Inanna, though their relationship was complicated and hostile, as shown in the famous myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld. Ereshkigal was eventually joined by Nergal, who became her consort and co-ruler of the dead. Together they presided over a bureaucratic underworld that mirrored the structure of Sumerian city-states, complete with judges, guards, and gatekeepers. The journey to the Kur was perilous. The dead had to cross rivers and pass through 7 gates, at each one surrendering a piece of their earthly status and possessions, until they arrived naked and powerless before Ereshkigal's throne. The Anunnaki, the great gods, served as judges in the underworld, determining each spirit's place in the hierarchy of the dead. This wasn't judgment based on moral behavior, as in later religious traditions, but rather on one's status in life and the quality of one's burial rites. The text described the underworld with vivid imagery. It was a place where people sat in dust, where their food was dust and their drink was muddy water. They wore feather garments like birds, a detail that appears in multiple sources and may relate to the belief that spirits were ethereal, almost weightless beings. Light never reached the Kur. The sun god Shamash visited it every night on his journey through the cosmos, bringing temporary illumination. But when he left, darkness returned. Despite this grim description, the underworld wasn't depicted as uniformly terrible. Some texts suggest that kings and heroes received better treatment than common people. The death of Gilgamesh describes the legendary king arriving in the underworld and being greeted with rejoicing, seated in a place of honor among the great kings who had died before him. He's given responsibilities as a judge of the dead, maintaining some of his earthly authority even in death. This suggests that status, at least to some degree, could transfer to the afterlife. The Descent of Inanna provides one of the most detailed descriptions of the underworld's structure and rules. When the goddess descends to visit her sister Ereshkigal, perhaps to attend a funeral, or possibly to attempt to take over of the realm of the dead, she must pass through 7 gates. At each gate she's forced to remove one item: her royal crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her rings, her measuring rod and line, and finally her royal robe. By the time she reaches Ereshkigal's throne, she's completely naked and powerless, stripped of all the attributes that made her a goddess. This stripping away of identity is a powerful metaphor for death itself. In the underworld, earthly achievements and possessions mean nothing. You arrive as you were born, without clothes or status or power, reduced to your bare essence as a human spirit. The myth then describes how Inanna is judged by the Anunnaki and turned into a corpse, hung on a hook to rot. She's only rescued when Enki, hearing of her plight, creates special beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails who can slip into the underworld unnoticed and revive her with the food and water of life. Inanna's eventual escape from the underworld is significant because it's extremely rare. The dead don't come back. That's the fundamental rule of the Kur. Once you pass through those 7 gates and stand before Ereshkigal, you're there forever. The only exception is if someone takes your place, which is what happens to Inanna's husband Dumuzi in some versions of the myth. He fails to mourn her death properly, sitting on her throne and wearing fine clothes instead of tearing his garments in grief, so Inanna decrees that he will spend half the year in the underworld while she returns to the surface. This myth, celebrating the cycle of seasons, is one of the few that suggests any possibility of movement between the world of the living and the world of the dead. For ordinary humans, there was no escape from the Kur. You died, you were buried with the proper rites, offerings were made to sustain your spirit, and you joined the countless generations who had gone before. The quality of your afterlife depended largely on how well your descendants maintained your cult of the dead. If they remembered you, brought offerings to your tomb, spoke your name, you existed in relative comfort in the underworld. If they forgot you, your spirit would hunger and potentially become malevolent. Archaeological evidence supports the textual descriptions. Sumerian burials often included grave goods, pottery, weapons, jewellery, things the deceased might need in the afterlife. Some tombs had pipes leading down to the burial chamber, through which offerings of food and drink could be poured for the dead. This practice continued for centuries, showing how seriously the Sumerians took their obligations to the deceased. Failing to care for the dead wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous, as unhappy spirits could cause trouble for the living. The tablets also describe various demonic beings that inhabited the Kur, or travelled between worlds. The Gala, sometimes called the constables of the underworld, were particularly feared. They were enforcers who could be sent to drag living people to the realm of the dead. They appear in the Inanna myth as the beings who accompany her back to the surface world to seize Dumuzi. Namtar, the god of pestilence and death's messenger, could strike anyone at any time, bringing sudden death. The Udug, disease-bearing entities, and the Samana, strange animal-shaped demons, all threatened humans with premature death. These demonic beings weren't evil in the modern sense. They were simply doing the work assigned to them by the gods, maintaining the boundary between life and death, ensuring that the dead stayed dead and that the living died according to their decreed fate. Protection against them came through magic, through incantations that invoked the power of the great gods, and through maintaining proper relationships with both the gods and one's ancestral spirits. The Sumerian view of the afterlife, while grim, had a certain practical wisdom. It didn't promise paradise for the righteous or torture for the wicked. It acknowledged that death was the great leveler, that everyone ended up in the same dusty darkness regardless of their earthly achievements. This meant that immortality, if it could be achieved at all, had to be found not in escaping death, but in being remembered. Legacy, fame, accomplishment, children who would remember you and speak your name, these were the only realistic paths to a kind of eternity. This brings us back to the question of why the gods decreed mortality for humans. We've seen the practical reasons: population control, maintaining the distinction between divine and mortal, ensuring that humans would serve the gods rather than rival them. But there's a deeper philosophical point that runs through the tablets. Death gives meaning to life. If we lived forever, our choices wouldn't matter. Time would be infinite, so there would be no urgency to achieve anything. But because we die, because our time is limited, every moment becomes precious. Every choice carries weight. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their greatest hero, Gilgamesh, would learn it through bitter experience. When his friend Enkidu died, Gilgamesh became terrified of his own mortality and set out on a desperate quest to find immortality. He would fail, as he must fail, because the gods had decreed death for humanity. But in failing he would learn what truly matters, not living forever, but living well, making something that endures beyond your lifetime, whether that's a great city, a work of art, or simply the memory you leave in the hearts of those who loved you. The story of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple Sumerian poems and later woven into the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, represents the fullest expression of Mesopotamian thought about mortality. It takes the theological principles we've been discussing, death as ordained fate, the impossibility of human immortality, the importance of legacy, and dramatizes them through the journey of one man who refused to accept his mortality. Understanding Gilgamesh's quest and its inevitable failure helps us understand what the Sumerians meant when they said that Enki ordained death for humanity from our inception. Gilgamesh was the legendary king of Uruk, a city in southern Mesopotamia. According to the Sumerian king list, he ruled sometime around 2700 BCE, though the historical Gilgamesh, if he existed, is lost to time. What we have instead is the myth that grew around his name, stories that were already ancient when the first tablets recording them were inscribed 4,000 years ago. These stories paint Gilgamesh as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, impossibly strong, fearless and arrogant. In the earlier Sumerian poems, he's a hero who battles demons, builds great walls, and descends to the underworld. In the later epic of Gilgamesh, he becomes something more complex, a man confronting his own mortality and learning, painfully, what it means to be human. The epic begins with Gilgamesh as a tyrant so powerful and arrogant that his people cry out to the gods for relief. The gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man raised by animals strong enough to challenge Gilgamesh and humble him. But when the two meet and fight, something unexpected happens. They become friends, brothers in all but blood, complementing each other perfectly. Gilgamesh's refinement balances Enkidu's wildness. Enkidu's humility tempers Gilgamesh's pride. Together they embark on adventures, defeating the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest and killing the bull of heaven sent by the angry goddess Ishtar. These adventures are glorious, the stuff of legend, exactly the kind of deeds that bring fame and immortality of a sort. Gilgamesh and Enkidu become heroes whose names will be remembered for generations. But their triumphs anger the gods, killing Humbaba, who guarded the sacred cedars, and slaying the bull of heaven sent by Ishtar herself, are acts of hubris, of mortals overstepping their bounds. The gods convene and decide that one of the two heroes must die as punishment. They choose Enkidu. The death of Enkidu is described with devastating emotional power. He sickens gradually, suffering for days before finally succumbing. Gilgamesh watches his friend waste away, helpless to save him. The tablets preserve Enkidu's dreams of the underworld, visions of the dark house where the dead sit in dust and darkness. He describes it to Gilgamesh. This place they will both eventually go, and Gilgamesh is horrified. When Enkidu finally dies, Gilgamesh's grief is overwhelming. He refuses to accept it sitting with Enkidu's body until he sees a worm drop from his friend's nose, physical proof that death has truly claimed him. But Gilgamesh's grief quickly transforms into something else, terror for his own mortality. For the first time in his life, death becomes real to him. He'd known intellectually that he was mortal, that his 1/3 human nature meant he would eventually die. But knowing something abstractly is different from feeling it viscerally. Watching Enkidu die, Gilgamesh suddenly understood that the same fate awaited him. His strength, his divine blood, his achievements, none of it would save him. He too would become a corpse, would descend to the dark house, would sit in dust and eat clay forever. This realization breaks something in Gilgamesh. He tears his clothes, puts on animal skins, and begins to wander the wilderness, no longer the proud king, but a grief-stricken man fleeing from the knowledge of his own mortality. But he's not just fleeing. He's searching for the one human who supposedly escaped death, Utnapishtim, known in Sumerian as Ziusudra, the flood hero who was granted immortality by the gods. If Utnapishtim could become immortal, perhaps Gilgamesh could too. Perhaps there was a loophole, a way around Enki's decree that all humans must die. The journey to find Utnapishtim takes Gilgamesh to the ends of the earth. He crosses the mountains where the sun rises, mountains guarded by scorpion people, being so terrifying that ordinary mortals would die just from seeing them. He travels through 12 leagues of darkness, a tunnel beneath the mountain where no light penetrates. He emerges in a garden of jewels, where trees bear fruit made of precious stones. Here he meets Siduri, a divine barmaid who tries to dissuade him from his quest. Siduri's advice is worth examining because it represents one Sumerian response to mortality. She tells Gilgamesh to abandon his futile search for immortality and instead enjoy the life he has. Fill your belly with good food, she says, wear fine clothes, bathe in fresh water, cherish the child who holds your hand, make your wife happy with your embrace. This is what it means to be human, to accept mortality and find joy in the temporary pleasures of life. It's practical wisdom, the advice of someone who understands that death is inevitable and sees no point in raging against it. But Gilgamesh cannot accept this. He's obsessed now, driven by fear and grief to continue his quest. Siduri finally tells him how to reach Utnapishtim, who lives at the mouth of the rivers at the edge of the world. She directs him to Ushanabi, the ferryman who can take him across the waters of death, waters so poisonous that even touching them means instant death. Through clever engineering, using punting poles to push the boat without ever touching the deadly waters, Gilgamesh makes the crossing. He finds Utnapishtim on the far shore. The meeting is anticlimactic in a way that's deeply intentional. Gilgamesh expects to find someone special, someone who looks immortal, who radiates divine power. Instead, he finds an old man, ordinary in appearance, who asks him why he looks so terrible. Gilgamesh explains his quest, his grief for Enkidu, his terror of death, his hope that Utnapishtim can teach him the secret of immortality. And Utnapishtim's response is brutal in its honesty. There is no secret. Immortality cannot be achieved through human effort. Utnapishtim only became immortal because the gods granted it to him after the flood, a one-time exception that will never be repeated. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, explaining how he survived by building a boat on Enki's secret instructions, how he endured the 7 days and nights of the deluge, how he made sacrifices that drew the starving gods like flies to honey. The gods, grateful for his preservation of life and moved by his piety, granted him and his wife immortality and set them to live at the edge of the world. But this was a unique reward for a unique situation. It proves nothing about the possibility of other humans achieving immortality. To drive the point home, Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to a test. If Gilgamesh wants to become immortal, to cheat death forever, he must first conquer death's little brother, sleep. If he can stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, Utnapishtim will consider teaching him further secrets. Gilgamesh agrees, confident in his strength. But the moment he sits down, he falls into a deep sleep. Utnapishtim instructs his wife to bake a loaf of bread each day and place it beside the sleeping Gilgamesh, marking the passage of time. When Utnapishtim finally wakes him after 7 days, Gilgamesh protests that he only dozed for a moment. But the loaves of bread tell the truth. The freshest is still soft, baked just today. The oldest is hard and mouldy, baked 7 days ago. Gilgamesh has failed the test. He cannot even conquer sleep. How could he possibly conquer death? The realization devastates him. He's journeyed to the end of the world, faced impossible dangers, crossed the waters of death, and it was all for nothing. He cannot become immortal. Death will claim him as it claims all humans. But Utnapishtim's wife takes pity on the grief-stricken king. She convinces her husband to offer Gilgamesh a consolation prize, knowledge of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. This plant cannot grant true immortality, but it can restore youth, allowing an old person to become young again. It's called the plant of heartbeat, or in some translations, the old man becomes young again. Gilgamesh, desperate for anything that might delay death, ties stones to his feet and descends to the ocean floor. He finds the plant and plucks it, cutting his hands on its thorns. But he doesn't use it immediately. Instead, he decides to test it on an old man in Uruk before trusting it himself. On the journey back, Gilgamesh stops at a pool to bathe. He leaves the plant on the shore, and while he's in the water, a serpent, attracted by the plant's fragrance, slithers out from the reeds and eats it. The snake immediately sheds its old skin and slithers away renewed, young again. This is why snakes can shed their skins and appear reborn, because they stole the rejuvenation meant for humanity. Gilgamesh emerges from his bath to find the plant gone and the snake's discarded skin lying there, mocking evidence of what he's lost. Gilgamesh weeps. "For whom have I laboured?" he cries. "For whom have I journeyed? For whom have I suffered? I have gained absolutely nothing for myself. I have only profited the snake, the ground lion. Everything he's endured, the grief, the terror, the impossible journey, the crossing of the waters of death, all of it was for nothing. He's still mortal. He will still die. And now he doesn't even have the plant that might have delayed that death." But something shifts in Gilgamesh on the journey back to Uruk. He's changed by his failures. When he finally reaches home, exhausted and empty-handed, he sees his city with new eyes. He looks at the great walls of Uruk, walls that he built or restored, walls that will stand for generations. He sees the temples, the streets, the civilization he's helped create, and in that moment, Gilgamesh finds a different kind of immortality. He cannot live forever in body. but his works will endure. His name will be remembered. The walls of Uruk will stand as testament to his greatness long after his body has turned to dust. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing these walls to Anunnaki, the ferryman who helped him cross the waters of death. He speaks with pride about the bricks, fired in kilns to withstand time, laid by the 7 sages in patterns of perfection. The walls encompass not just the city but orchards and clay pits, a complete civilization within their circuit. This is his immortality, not escaping death, but creating something that outlasts death, not living forever, but being remembered forever. This conclusion represents the mature Sumerian understanding of mortality. Gilgamesh began his quest believing that death was something to be defeated, an enemy to be overcome through strength or cleverness. He ends it understanding that death is simply part of the human condition, decreed by the gods from the moment of our creation. Fighting against it is futile, but accepting it doesn't mean despair. It means finding meaning in the time you have, creating works that endure, building walls that will stand when you're gone, loving people who will remember you, achieving deeds worthy of being recorded on tablets. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself becomes a kind of immortality for the king. Whether or not a historical Gilgamesh actually lived and ruled Uruk, the literary Gilgamesh has achieved eternal life through the story itself. 4,000 years after these tablets were inscribed, we're still reading his story, still moved by his grief for Enkidu, still understanding his terror of death, still appreciating his final acceptance of mortality. The scribes who wrote these tablets understood this paradox. The epic frames itself as Gilgamesh's own account, inscribed on stone tablets by the city gates of Uruk, telling future generations about his failed quest for immortality. By writing it down, by preserving the story, Gilgamesh achieved the very thing he sought, a life that transcends death. This brings us to the deeper meaning of Enki's decree that death was ordained for humanity from our inception. It wasn't just a practical measure to control population or maintain divine hierarchy. It was a fundamental aspect of what makes us human. The gods live forever, which means they have infinite time. But infinite time means no urgency, no deadline, no particular reason to create or achieve anything today rather than tomorrow. Humans, with our limited lifespans, must make our time count. We must build and create and love with intensity precisely because we know our time is limited. The Sumerians expressed this understanding through multiple metaphors. Life is compared to a mayfly floating on water, existing for a moment in the sun before disappearing. Human existence is like a reed in the wind, bending and breaking before the storm. We're temporary, fragile, certain to die. But within that temporary existence, we can create meaning. We can build cities that outlast us. We can have children who carry our names. We can accomplish deeds worthy of being remembered in songs and stories. We can love deeply, knowing that love will end in separation, but choosing to love anyway, because the alternative, a life without love, without striving, without meaning, is worse than death. The tablets make another crucial point about mortality. Death is democratic. It comes for everyone, king and commoner, hero and coward, wise and foolish. Gilgamesh, despite being 2/3 divine, must die like any other human. Utnapishtim's immortality is presented as an anomaly, a one-time exception that proves the rule rather than establishing a precedent. For everyone else, death is certain. This certainty paradoxically creates equality. In the underworld, earthly distinctions fade. Kings may get better seats, but everyone sits in the same dark realm, eating the same dust. This democratic view of death had real social implications. If death was the great leveler, then perhaps earthly hierarchies weren't as absolute as they might seem. A king could demand obedience during life, but in death, he was just another spirit in the Kur. This perspective appears in the Sumerian wisdom literature, which often emphasizes the temporary nature of power and the futility of excessive pride. You may be king today, but tomorrow you'll be dust like everyone else. This knowledge should inspire humility, compassion, and a focus on lasting achievements rather than temporary pleasures. The Sumerian acceptance of mortality also shaped their religious practices. Since the gods had decreed death from the beginning, there was no point in praying for immortality. Instead, prayers focused on practical concerns, long life within human limits, health, prosperity, successful harvests, protection from premature death. They didn't ask to live forever, they asked to live well until their appointed time came, and when death did come, they wanted proper burial rites, regular offerings from descendants, and remembrance that would sustain their spirits in the underworld. The cult of the dead was central to Sumerian religious life. Each family maintained a shrine to their ancestors, making regular offerings of food and drink. Tombs were built with channels through which libations could be poured to the deceased. The dead were believed to need sustenance, and providing it was both an act of love and a necessity. A forgotten ancestor might become a dangerous ghost, bringing sickness or misfortune to the family. But a well-tended ancestor could bless and protect their descendants. This created a chain linking the living and the dead, past and present, mortality and memory. The tablets also preserve numerous incantations and rituals designed to protect the living from premature death. While death itself was inevitable, dying before your appointed time was a tragedy to be prevented. Demons like Namtar could strike anyone at any moment, bringing disease and death. Protection came through invoking the great gods, particularly Enki, who as creator of humanity often appeared as our protector. Incantations would call on Enki's wisdom and power to drive away death-bringing demons, to heal sickness, to restore health. These weren't attempts to escape death entirely, but to ensure that death came at the proper time, after a full life, not prematurely through malice or bad fortune. The Sumerians also developed sophisticated medical practices, treating illness and injury with both practical remedies and magical incantations. They understood that the gods had given them some agency over their health, some ability to delay death through knowledge and care, but they also knew that ultimately, when your time came, all the medicine and magic in the world couldn't save you. The best you could hope for was a good death, surrounded by family with your affairs in order, ready to descend to the Kur with dignity. This brings us to one of the most profound aspects of the Sumerian view of death. They didn't see it as the opposite of life, but as its continuation in a different form. The Atemu, the spirit that survived bodily death, wasn't a completely different entity from the living person. It was the same individual, just in a changed state. The dead weren't gone. They were present in the underworld, aware of what happened in the world above, capable of affecting it through blessings or curses. Death didn't end your existence. It transformed it. This understanding is reflected in how the Sumerians talked to their dead. Prayers and lamentations addressed deceased relatives directly, asking for help, explaining circumstances, seeking forgiveness. The boundary between living and dead was permeable in certain ritual contexts. Necromancy, calling up the spirits of the dead for consultation, appears in several texts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh's 12th tablet, Enkidu's spirit returns from the underworld to tell Gilgamesh what death is like, describing the hierarchies of the dead, the importance of having many sons to make offerings, the terrible fate of those who died without proper burial. These conversations with the dead reveal a kind of comfort in Sumerian attitudes toward death. Yes, the underworld was dark and dusty and not particularly pleasant, but it wasn't annihilation. You continued to exist, to have some form of consciousness and experience. You could still receive offerings from loved ones, still be honored and remembered. And if you'd lived well, if you'd had many children who would remember you, if you'd accomplished deeds worthy of being recorded, then your existence in the underworld would have meaning and some measure of honor. The tablets we've been examining, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Death of Gilgamesh, various hymns and lamentations, all express variations on this central theme. Death was ordained for humanity from our creation. We are mortal by divine decree. This mortality shapes everything about human existence, from our urgency to achieve, to our need for relationships, to our religious practices, to our very sense of meaning. The Sumerians didn't waste time railing against this cosmic injustice because they didn't see it as unjust. It was simply the way things were, the way the gods had decreed they should be. Understanding this helps us appreciate why these ancient texts remain so powerful. They're not promising escape from death or offering false hope of immortality. They're teaching us how to live well within the bounds of mortality, how to create meaning despite knowing we'll die, how to achieve a kind of immortality through our works and our legacy. These lessons transcend culture and time. 4,000 years after these tablets were inscribed, we're still grappling with the same questions. How do we face our mortality? How do we make meaning in a limited lifespan? How do we leave something behind that matters? The Sumerian answer, preserved on clay tablets in wedge-shaped script, is surprisingly relevant to modern life. Don't waste time seeking impossible immortality. Accept that you'll die, and let that acceptance sharpen your appreciation for life. Build something that will outlast you. Love deeply despite knowing that love will end. Create, strive, achieve, knowing that these accomplishments give your temporary existence eternal significance. Your body will return to dust, but your works, your children, your influence on others, these can continue indefinitely. That's the only immortality available to mortals, and it's enough. The influence of Sumerian thought about death extended far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. When the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians conquered the region, they adopted and adapted Sumerian mythology, translating the texts into their own languages, adding details and interpretations but keeping the core ideas intact. The Atrahasis epic was copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, evolving but never fundamentally changing its message about why humans are mortal. The Gilgamesh story spread throughout the ancient Near East, influencing countless other cultures' understanding of mortality and the quest for meaning. Most significantly, Sumerian ideas about death clearly influenced the Hebrew Bible. The flood story in Genesis bears unmistakable similarities to the Sumerian and Akkadian versions, with Noah filling the role of Ziusudra or Atrahasis. The creation of humanity from dust in Genesis echoes the Sumerian creation from clay and divine blood. The Hebrew concept of Sheol, the underworld where the dead reside, closely resembles the Sumerian Kur, a dark place where everyone goes regardless of righteousness or wickedness. Even the biblical lifespan of 120 years appears in the Atrahasis epic as the limit set by the gods after the flood. Of course, there are significant differences. The biblical tradition introduced monotheism, replacing the pantheon of Mesopotamian gods with a single divine creator. It added the concept of sin and moral judgment in ways that weren't present in Sumerian thought, and over time, especially in later Jewish and Christian theology, ideas about resurrection and eternal life would develop that directly contradicted the Sumerian acceptance of mortality. But the underlying questions remained the same, and the Sumerian answers continued to resonate even as new theological frameworks tried to provide different solutions. The rediscovery of these tablets in the 19th century caused considerable excitement and controversy. Here was proof that the biblical flood story wasn't unique, that creation myths featuring clay and divine breath existed long before Genesis, that sophisticated theological thinking about mortality predated Jewish and Christian scripture by millennia. Some saw this as threatening to faith. Others saw it as enriching our understanding of how ancient peoples grappled with fundamental questions of existence. The debates continue today, but the tablets themselves remain, physical evidence of humanity's long contemplation of death and meaning. Reading these texts in the 21st century, we can't help but be struck by how modern they feel in some ways. The Sumerian acceptance of mortality is inevitable, the focus on creating lasting works rather than seeking impossible immortality, the emphasis on love and relationships despite their temporary nature. These ideas resonate with secular humanist thought today. The Gilgamesh's journey from denial of death to acceptance and finding meaning in legacy mirrors the psychological process that modern people still go through when confronting mortality. At the same time, we've lost something that the Sumerians had, a clear cosmological framework that explained why death exists and what happens after. They could point to tablets that said Enki ordained death from our inception. They knew exactly what the underworld was like because their myths described it in detail. They understood their place in the cosmic order, created to serve the gods, mortal by divine decree, destined for the cur but capable of achieving immortality through memory. Modern people, especially in secular contexts, often lack this kind of certainty. We know we'll die, but we don't know why or what, if anything, comes after. The Sumerian framework, whether we believe it or not, at least provided answers. There's also something powerful about how the Sumerians integrated death into their daily lives. They maintained ancestor shrines, made regular offerings to the dead, told stories about the underworld, performed rituals to protect against premature death. Death wasn't hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes. It was present, acknowledged, incorporated into the rhythm of life. Children grew up understanding that everyone dies, that the dead continue to exist in the cur, that remembering and honouring the deceased is a sacred duty. This integration of death into life might have made mortality easier to accept than our modern tendency to isolate and deny it. The tablets also reveal something about the power of writing itself as a form of immortality. The Sumerians invented writing around 3000 BCE, initially for practical purposes like recording grain stores and commercial transactions, but they quickly realized that writing could preserve not just numbers, but stories, prayers, wisdom, and names. The scribe who carved Gilgamesh's story onto clay tablets 4,000 years ago achieved his own immortality. We don't know his name, but his work survives, still moving readers millennia after his death. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the Sumerian meditation on mortality. They wrote that death was ordained for all humans, that immortality was impossible, that we must accept our temporary existence. But by writing these thoughts on clay tablets, by preserving them for future generations, they achieved exactly the kind of immortality they said was unattainable. Not physical immortality, not eternal life in body, but something arguably more meaningful. Immortality through ideas, through stories, through the transmission of wisdom across vast expanses of time. When we read the Atrahasis epic today and encounter the moment when Enki decrees death for humanity, we're connecting directly with Sumerian thought from over 4,000 years ago. The physical body of the scribe who wrote that line is long since dust, but his words live on. The kings he may have served are forgotten, but the stories he preserved continue to teach and move people. This is the immortality that the Sumerians understood, the only kind truly available to mortals. Not escape from death, but transcendence through legacy. Consider what this means for us today. We have capabilities the Sumerians never dreamed of. We can preserve not just text, but images, sounds, videos. We can share our thoughts with millions instantaneously. We can contribute to projects that will outlive us by centuries. The walls of Uruk have crumbled, but we're building digital monuments that might last as long as human civilization itself. The question is, what are we building? Are we creating works worthy of remembrance? Or are we wasting our limited time on things that won't matter? The Sumerian tablets challenge us to think seriously about mortality and meaning. They don't offer the comfort of an afterlife paradise. They don't promise that good behavior will be rewarded or that faith will grant eternal life. They simply say, you're going to die. This was decreed from the moment humanity was created, so make your life count while you have it. Build something. Create something. Love someone. Achieve something worthy of being remembered. That's all you can do, and it's enough. This message is both harsh and liberating. Harsh because it doesn't sugarcoat mortality or offer false hope. Liberating because it removes the pressure of achieving actual immortality and focuses instead on the achievable goal of living well and leaving something behind. You don't need to be a king like Gilgamesh or a wise man like Atrahasis. You just need to do something that matters, something that will be remembered, something that contributes to the continuing story of humanity. The Sumerians also understood something crucial about the relationship between mortality and community. They emphasized having children who would remember you, maintaining family shrines to ancestors, belonging to a city whose walls would outlast your individual life. Immortality in this view isn't individual, it's collective. You live on through your descendants, through the community you are part of, through the civilization you helped build. This is why Gilgamesh returns to Uruk and finds meaning in the city's walls. They're not just his achievement, they're the achievement of everyone who helped build them, who will maintain them, who will live protected by them. His individual immortality is bound up with the immortality of Uruk itself. This collective understanding of immortality stands in sharp contrast to modern Western individualism, which often focuses on personal achievement and individual legacy. The Sumerian view suggests that we're only truly immortal when we're part of something larger than ourselves, when our individual contributions blend into a greater whole that continues beyond our deaths. The scribe who wrote the Gilgamesh epic didn't sign his name, his individual identity is lost, but his contribution to human culture lives on, more powerful for being part of an anonymous collective effort spanning generations. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient tablets, we should reflect on what we've learned about the moment death entered the world according to Sumerian thought. Death didn't enter the world at a specific moment. It was there from the beginning, ordained by Enki when he created humanity, built into our very nature as deliberately as our capacity for thought or speech. The creation of humans from clay and divine blood was simultaneously the creation of mortality. The two cannot be separated. To be human is to be mortal, but death's manifestation intensified after the flood. The population control measures instituted by Enki and Nintu made death more active, more present throughout human life. Infant mortality, barrenness, shortened lifespans, these became part of the human experience in a way they perhaps hadn't been before. This intensification of death was the price of humanity's survival. We could continue to exist, but only if death kept our numbers in check. The alternative was annihilation, another flood, complete extinction. Death became not just our curse but our salvation, the thing that allowed us to continue existing at all. The tablets also reveal something profound about how death shapes consciousness. Before Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh didn't truly understand his mortality. He knew it intellectually, but it didn't govern his actions or his worldview. After Enkidu's death, after watching his friend waste away and turn to clay, Gilgamesh became fully conscious of his mortality in a way that terrified him. This awakening of death consciousness is presented as a crucial part of becoming fully human. You're not really human, not really mature, until you've confronted your own mortality and come to terms with it. This suggests that the Sumerians understood something modern psychology has rediscovered, that awareness of death fundamentally shapes how we live. Terror management theory, a modern psychological framework, argues that much of human behavior is driven by our need to manage the anxiety caused by awareness of our mortality. We create meaning systems, build monuments, seek achievements, form communities, all partially to convince ourselves that we matter, that our lives have significance despite being temporary. The Sumerians understood this 4,000 years ago. They knew that consciousness of death drove us to create, to achieve, to build civilizations. The tablets we've examined tonight, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu-Genesis, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Death of Gilgamesh, various hymns and incantations, all contribute to a sophisticated theology of death that remains relevant today. They tell us that death is natural, ordained by the gods from our creation, an essential part of what makes us human. They tell us that immortality is impossible but that legacy is achievable. They tell us to accept our mortality while still striving to create meaning within our limited time. And they tell us that being remembered, having your name spoken after you're gone, is a kind of eternal life available to all who live well and create works worthy of memory. As we conclude this exploration, I want to return to where we started, with the discovery of these tablets in the ruins of ancient cities. When archaeologists first unearthed these clay tablets, they were recovering voices from 4,000 years ago, thoughts and stories that had been buried and forgotten for millennia. But the tablets survived because clay, when baked, is nearly indestructible. The very fires that burned the libraries of ancient Mesopotamia only hardened the tablets, preserving them for future discovery. This is its own kind of immortality. Words written 4,000 years ago still readable, still meaningful, still teaching us about mortality and meaning. The Sumerian scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay before baking it hard couldn't have imagined that their work would survive so long. They were writing for their contemporaries, recording myths and stories that their culture already knew, but by writing them down, by preserving them in a medium that could endure, they achieved exactly what Gilgamesh achieved when he supposedly inscribed his story on stone by the gates of Uruk. They made their thoughts immortal. The bodies that wrote these words are dust. The cities where they lived are ruins. The civilization they were part of disappeared thousands of years ago, but their words remain, still teaching, still challenging, still moving those who encounter them. This is the ultimate proof of the Sumerian thesis about death and immortality. Physical immortality is impossible. The gods decreed death for humanity from our inception. Every person who has ever lived has died or will die. But immortality through legacy, through works that endure, through ideas that continue to influence and inspire, this is real. This is achievable. This is the only immortality that matters, and it's available to anyone who creates something worthy of remembrance. The moment death entered the world, according to the Sumerians, was the moment humanity was created. Death and human existence are inseparable, two sides of the same coin. We exist because the gods created us, and we die because the gods decreed it. This decree isn't cruel or arbitrary. It's fundamental to the cosmic order, to the distinction between divine and mortal, to the very possibility of meaning in our lives. Without death, there would be no urgency. Without urgency, there would be no achievement. Without achievement, there would be no legacy. Without legacy, there would be no immortality of the kind that actually matters. The Sumerian tablets teach us to accept death without despair, to acknowledge our mortality without surrendering to nihilism. They show us that meaning comes not from denying death, but from creating despite it, from building walls that will stand when we're gone, from loving people who will remember us, from contributing to the great collective project of human civilization that continues across generations. Our individual lives are brief, mayflies floating on water, reeds bending in the wind. But what we create, what we contribute, who we love, these can endure indefinitely, part of the great chain linking past, present and future. So when we ask when death entered the world, the Sumerian answer is clear. Death was there from the beginning, woven into our creation, ordained by Enki, the wise god who made us from clay and divine blood. It was always part of the plan. The question isn't when death entered the world, but how we respond to its presence. Do we rage against it futilely like Gilgamesh in his grief? Do we accept it passively like the dead sitting in dust in the Kur? Or do we find the middle path, accepting mortality while still striving for immortality through legacy, through works that endure, through contributions that matter? The tablets scattered across dozens of archaeological sites, fragmentary and damaged but still readable after 4 millennia, are themselves an answer to this question. The scribes who wrote them found the middle path. They accepted that they would die, but wrote anyway, preserving wisdom and stories for future generations. We're reading their words tonight, connecting across vast spans of time with people who understood something fundamental about human existence. They're dead, as everyone must die. But they're also alive in these words, in these stories, in these ideas that continue to resonate and teach and inspire. This is the gift the Sumerians give us, not a denial of death or a promise of paradise, but a realistic, profound understanding of what it means to be mortal and how to find meaning within mortality's constraints. When Enki ordained death for humanity from our inception, he also created the possibility of legacy, of works that outlast their creators, of immortality through remembrance rather than immortality of body. 4,000 years later, we're still learning from these tablets, still moved by Gilgamesh's grief and journey, still inspired by the wisdom preserved in wedge-shaped marks on clay. Before we close, I want you to think about your own mortality for a moment, not in a morbid way, but in the Sumerian way, as a reality that gives meaning to your life. You're going to die. This was decreed from the moment humans were created. The question is, what will you build before you die? What will you create that might outlast you? How will you be remembered? What contribution will you make to the great ongoing project of human civilization? These aren't easy questions, but they're important ones. The same questions the Sumerians asked 4,000 years ago. The tablets tell us that death is certain, but legacy is possible. Your body will return to dust, but your influence, your creations, your love, your children, your ideas, these can continue indefinitely. That's the only immortality available to mortals, and according to the Sumerians, it's enough. It's what makes life meaningful despite its brevity, what gives our temporary existence eternal significance. When you understand this, when you truly accept both your mortality and your capacity for legacy, you've learned what Gilgamesh learned at the end of his failed quest for immortality. So the Sumerian tablets reveal the moment death entered the world, the moment humanity was created, and they also reveal how to live well in the face of that mortality. Accept it. Don't waste time fighting the inevitable, but also don't surrender to meaninglessness. Build something, create something, love someone, leave the world a little better than you found it. Make your life count in the limited time you have. That's the wisdom preserved on clay tablets, 4,000 years ago, still relevant, still true, still worth learning today. And with that understanding, we conclude our journey through the Sumerian tablets and their revelations about death, mortality, and the human condition. These ancient voices still speak to us across millennia, reminding us that the questions we ask about life and death aren't new, that humans have been grappling with mortality since we first became conscious enough to understand it, that the quest for meaning in the face of death is one of the defining features of human existence. The Sumerians found their answers and recorded them on clay. What answers will you find, and how will you record them for those who come after? The gods responded to the people's complaints by creating someone who could match Gilgamesh, someone equal in strength and wild in nature. This was Enkidu, formed from clay and spittle by the goddess Aruru, living among animals in the wilderness knowing nothing of civilization or human society. He was everything Gilgamesh was not, humble where Gilgamesh was proud, gentle where Gilgamesh was harsh, connected to nature where Gilgamesh was committed to civilization and city life. When Gilgamesh heard about this wild man who lived with gazelles and protected animals from hunters, he sent a temple prostitute named Shamhat to civilize Enkidu through seduction. This wasn't crude manipulation, but rather a recognized path to civilization in Sumerian thought. Shamhat spent 7 days and nights with Enkidu, and through their intimacy, he became human in a way he hadn't been before. The animals who had been his companions rejected him. He could no longer run as fast or understand their language, but he gained human consciousness, awareness, the ability to think and speak as humans do. Shamhat brought Enkidu to Uruk to meet Gilgamesh, and the two immediately fought. The texts describe an epic battle between equals, two men of superhuman strength testing each other, neither able to gain advantage. They wrestled through the streets of Uruk, crashed through doorways, shook buildings with the force of their struggle. But when the fight finally ended in something like a draw, something unexpected happened. They didn't become enemies as the gods perhaps intended. They became friends, brothers in all but blood, each recognizing in the other the one person in the world who truly understood them. Gilgamesh's refinement and civilization balanced Enkidu's wildness and connection to nature. Enkidu's humility and gentleness tempered Gilgamesh's pride and cruelty. Together they complemented each other perfectly, each becoming better through their friendship. Gilgamesh stopped oppressing his people because Enkidu's moral sense restrained him. Enkidu gained purpose and direction because Gilgamesh's ambition inspired him. They were fire and ice, culture and nature, perfectly balanced. Together they embarked on adventures that would make them legendary. They decided to journey to the cedar forest, a sacred grove far from Uruk, to cut down its trees and kill the guardian demon Humbaba who protected them. This wasn't simple theft or vandalism, but rather a quest for glory and fame. Gilgamesh wanted to make a name for himself that would last forever. He wanted to achieve something so great that future generations would remember him. Cutting down the sacred cedars and defeating their supernatural guardian would bring that fame, that immortality of remembrance that was the only kind of immortality available to mortals. The journey to the cedar forest was long and dangerous. Gilgamesh and Enkidu faced various obstacles and had prophetic dreams along the way. When they finally reached the forest and confronted Humbaba, the demon pleaded for his life, offering to serve them if they would spare him. But the heroes, driven by their quest for glory, killed Humbaba despite his pleas. They cut down the sacred cedars and brought the timber back to Uruk in triumph. It was a great achievement, exactly the kind of heroic deed that would be remembered and celebrated. But their triumph attracted divine attention of an unwelcome kind. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, saw Gilgamesh in all his glory and desired him. She proposed marriage, offering him divine favour and all the benefits that came with being the consort of a goddess. But Gilgamesh, perhaps remembering the fates of Ishtar's previous lovers, who had all come to bad ends, rejected her with insults. He listed her former paramours and what happened to each one, suggesting that accepting her offer would only bring him suffering. Ishtar, enraged by this rejection and public humiliation, went to her father Anu and demanded revenge. She convinced him to send the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk and punish Gilgamesh for his insolence. The Bull of Heaven was a cosmic monster whose breath could create sinkholes that swallowed hundreds of people at a time. It descended on Uruk and began destroying the city, killing people by the hundreds with each snort. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought the bull together and killed it, defeating a divine monster and saving their city. It was another triumph, another deed worthy of eternal fame. They displayed the bull's body publicly and celebrated their victory. Gilgamesh and Enkidu seemed unstoppable, capable of defeating any enemy, whether human, demonic, or divine. They had achieved glory beyond what most mortals could dream of. They were heroes whose names would be remembered forever, but their triumphs had consequences. They had killed Humbaba, guardian of the sacred cedar forest. They had slain the Bull of Heaven, a divine creature sent by the gods themselves. These weren't acts that the gods could ignore or forgive. The divine council convened to discuss what punishment these heroes deserved for their hubris, for their violations of divine prerogative, for daring to kill what the gods had created and protected. The gods debated which of the two heroes should die as punishment. They couldn't kill both because that would be excessive, but one of them had to pay the price for their offences. After discussion, they chose Enkidu, the wild man who had become civilized, who had found friendship and purpose in Gilgamesh, who had learned what it meant to be human through his adventures. He would be the one to die. The gods sent him a disease that would slowly waste him away, giving him time to understand what was happening and to face his death with full awareness. The death of Enkidu is described in the tablets with devastating emotional power that still moves readers 4,000 years later. He didn't die suddenly or heroically in battle. He sickened gradually, wasting away over days while Gilgamesh watched helplessly. The mighty king who could defeat demons and divine bulls couldn't save his friend from the disease the gods had sent. All his strength and courage meant nothing in the face of ordained death. Enkidu, as he lay dying, had dreams of the underworld. He saw visions of the Kur, the dark house where the dead sit in dust and darkness. He described these visions to Gilgamesh in detail that the tablets preserve. He saw the house whose dwellers are bereft of light, where dust is their food and clay their bread. He saw spirits clothed like birds with feather garments. He saw the darkness that would be his home forever. And he was afraid. Gilgamesh sat with his dying friend, refusing to leave his side, hoping desperately that somehow Enkidu would recover. But after 12 days of suffering, Enkidu died. And Gilgamesh, for the first time in his life, truly understood what death meant. He had known intellectually that he was mortal, that his 1/3 human nature meant he would eventually die like other humans. But knowing something abstractly is completely different from experiencing it viscerally, from watching someone you love waste away and cease to exist. Gilgamesh refused to believe Enkidu was dead at first. He sat with the body, talking to it, touching it, waiting for his friend to wake up. The texts describe how he remained there for 7 days, until finally he saw a worm drop from Enkidu's nose. That small, horrible detail, the physical proof of decay, finally convinced him that Enkidu was truly gone. His friend was dead. The body was already beginning to rot. Death had claimed Enkidu absolutely and finally. Gilgamesh's grief was overwhelming and all-consuming. He tore his clothes and hair. He roared like a lion who has lost her cubs. He ordered all of creation to mourn Enkidu, calling on the path they walked together and the beasts they hunted to never cease lamenting. But grief quickly transformed into something else, something even more powerful and more dangerous. Terror. For the first time, death became real to Gilgamesh not as an abstract future possibility, but as an immediate personal threat. Watching Enkidu die, Gilgamesh suddenly understood that the same fate awaited him. His strength wouldn't save him. His divine blood wouldn't save him. His achievements wouldn't save him. He too would sicken and waste away, would descend to the dark house, would sit in dust eating clay forever. The knowledge that he had always possessed theoretically became a visceral reality that he couldn't escape or deny. He was going to die. Not someday in the distant future, but inevitably, certainly perhaps sooner than he thought. This realization broke something in Gilgamesh. The proud king who had oppressed his people, the mighty hero who had defeated monsters and gods, became a frightened man fleeing from the knowledge of his own mortality. He couldn't bear to stay in Uruk anymore because everything there reminded him of Enkidu and death. He put on animal skins and began wandering the wilderness, living like a beast, trying to escape the civilization that had brought him face with mortality. But Gilgamesh wasn't just fleeing. He was searching. He had heard of one human who had escaped death, who had achieved what no other mortal had ever achieved. Utnapishtim, known in the Sumerian version as Ziusudra, the flood survivor who had been granted immortality by the gods. If Utnapishtim could become immortal, perhaps Gilgamesh could too. Perhaps there was a secret, a ritual, a formula that could be learned. Perhaps death could be defeated after all, despite what all the myths and teachings said about mortality being ordained from creation. Gilgamesh's quest for Utnapishtim took him on an impossible journey to the ends of the earth. He travelled beyond the known world, past the mountains where the sun rises. He reached the mountain where the sun entered the earth each evening and emerged each morning, a place guarded by scorpion people, beings so terrifying that ordinary mortals would die just from seeing them. But Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, and the scorpion people, impressed by his courage and driven by his divine aura, allowed him to pass. He entered the Road of the Sun, the tunnel beneath the mountain through which the sun god travelled during the night. This passage was 12 leagues of total darkness, so complete that Gilgamesh couldn't see his hands in front of his face. He walked for hours in absolute blackness, feeling his way forward, trusting that the passage would eventually end. Normal humans couldn't survive this journey, but Gilgamesh pushed forward, driven by his desperate need to escape death. After 12 leagues of darkness, he emerged into a garden of jewels, a place where trees bore fruit made of precious stones. This was the Garden of the Gods, a paradise at the edge of the world where divine beings walked. Here, Gilgamesh met Siduri, a divine barmaid who kept an inn at the edge of the world. She saw this wild, desperate man approaching and was frightened, barring her door against him. But when Gilgamesh explained who he was and what he sought, Siduri's response was significant. She didn't mock him or dismiss his quest. Instead, she offered him wisdom that represents one of the Sumerian responses to mortality. The lines she speaks are among the most beautiful and moving in all ancient literature, advice that echoes across 4,000 years, still relevant to modern readers, facing the same existential questions. Gilgamesh, she said, where are you wandering? The life you pursue you shall not find. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to humanity, but life they retained in their own keeping. You, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, make merry day and night. Of each day make a feast of rejoicing, day and night dance and play. Let your garments be sparkling fresh, your head be washed, bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. This is the philosophy of acceptance, of finding meaning and joy within mortal constraints rather than wasting life fighting against inevitable death. Siduri counsels Gilgamesh to abandon his futile quest, to return to Uruk, to embrace life's pleasures while he still can. Eat good food, wear clean clothes, bathe in fresh water, cherish your children, love your wife. Find joy in the daily experiences of living rather than obsessing over the fact that life must end. This is practical wisdom, the advice of someone who understands that death is inescapable and sees no point in raging against it. But Gilgamesh cannot accept this wisdom. He's too obsessed, too driven by fear, too convinced that there must be a way to escape mortality. He demands that Siduri tell him how to reach Utnapishtim, and eventually she does. She directs him to Ushabti, the ferryman who can take him across the waters of death, the cosmic ocean that separates the world of the living from where Utnapishtim dwells at the mouth of the rivers. The waters of death are so poisonous that even touching them means instant death for mortals. But Ushabti has special tools, the stone things, that allow him to cross these deadly waters safely. When Gilgamesh finds the ferryman, he's so agitated and desperate that he destroys the stone things in his rage, making the crossing seem impossible. But Ushabti, impressed, or perhaps intimidated by this wild king, finds another way. He instructs Gilgamesh to cut 300 punting poles, each to be used once and then discarded, allowing them to cross without ever touching the deadly water. The journey across the waters of death takes a month and a half according to some versions. Gilgamesh stands in the boat pushing it forward with pole after pole, each one touching the water and becoming contaminated, each one used once and thrown away, 300 poles for 300 pushes to cross the cosmic boundary between life and the dwelling place of the immortal flood survivor. When Gilgamesh finally reaches the far shore and meets Utnapishtim, the encounter is deliberately anticlimactic in a way that teaches a profound lesson. Gilgamesh has journeyed to the ends of the earth, faced impossible obstacles, crossed the waters of death, all to meet the one human who achieved immortality. He expects someone special, someone who looks immortal, who radiates divine power. Instead, he finds an old man, ordinary in appearance, who doesn't seem particularly impressed by his visitor. Utnapishtim looks at this wild, desperate king and asks him why he looks so terrible. Why is his face wasted? Why does he wear animal skins and wander like a beast? Gilgamesh explains his grief for Enkidu, his terror of death, his desperate hope that Utnapishtim can teach him the secret of immortality. And Utnapishtim's response is brutal in its honesty, devastating in its finality. There is no secret, he tells Gilgamesh. Immortality cannot be achieved through human effort or strength or cleverness. Utnapishtim only became immortal because the gods granted it to him after the flood, a unique exception made under circumstances that will never be repeated. It proves nothing about the possibility of other humans achieving the same thing. You cannot earn eternal life. You cannot win it through accomplishments. You cannot steal it or purchase it or learn it. It can only be given as a divine gift, and the gods gave it exactly once in all of human history. Utnapishtim then tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, explaining how he survived by building a boat on Enki's secret instructions, how he endured 7 days and nights of deluge, how he made sacrifices afterward that drew the starving gods like flies. The gods, grateful for his preservation of life and moved by his piety, granted him and his wife immortality and set them to dwell at the edge of the world. But this was a unique reward for a unique situation, a one-time exception that established no precedent and created no pathway for others to follow. To drive home the point about how impossible immortality is for mortals, Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to a test. If you want to become immortal, he says, if you want to cheat death forever, you must first conquer death's little brother. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights without sleeping, and I will consider teaching you further secrets. Sleep is like death, temporary unconsciousness, and if Gilgamesh cannot even conquer sleep, how could he possibly conquer death itself? Gilgamesh accepts the challenge confidently. He's strong and determined. He's come so far and overcome so much. Surely he can stay awake for less than a week. But the moment he sits down to begin the test, exhausted from his long journey, he falls into a deep sleep. the ordeal of crossing the waters of death, the emotional toll of his quest, the weariness accumulated over his wanderings, all of it catches up with him at once. Utnapishtim instructs his wife to bake a loaf of bread each day and place it beside the sleeping Gilgamesh, marking the passage of time with physical evidence that cannot be denied. Day after day, Gilgamesh sleeps while fresh loaves are added to the growing pile. The first loaf hardens, the second begins to dry, the third shows the first signs of mold. Each loaf represents another day past, another day that Gilgamesh has failed his test. After 7 full days, Utnapishtim finally wakes him. Gilgamesh, disoriented, protests that he only just dozed off for a moment. He's certain he's been awake the whole time, or nearly so. But Utnapishtim points to the loaves of bread arranged beside him. 7 loaves, in various states of decay from fresh to mouldy. Undeniable proof that 7 full days have passed. Gilgamesh stares at this evidence and realizes what it means. He has failed. He cannot even conquer sleep. He has no hope of conquering death. The realization devastates him more completely than anything that has come before. He has journeyed to the end of the world, crossed impossible barriers, faced death itself in the waters of death, all for nothing. He cannot become immortal. Death will claim him just as it claims all humans, just as the gods decreed at creation. All his strength, all his divine blood, all his achievements, none of it matters. He is mortal and will remain mortal until death takes him to the dark house. Gilgamesh begins to weep, overwhelmed by despair. "What shall I do?" he cries. "Where shall I go? Death has already devoured my body, death dwells in my bedroom. Wherever my foot rests, there I find death." It's a profound expression of how consciousness of mortality, once fully awakened, can colour every aspect of existence. Death isn't just a future event anymore. It's present in every moment, tainting everything, making joy and meaning seem impossible. But Utnapishtim's wife, watching this broken king weep, takes pity on him. She convinces her husband to offer Gilgamesh something, some consolation for his failed quest. Utnapishtim agrees and tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. This plant cannot grant true immortality, eternal life without end. But it can restore youth, allowing an old person to become young again. It's called How the Old Man Becomes Young, or in some translations, the plant of heartbeat or the plant of rejuvenation. Gilgamesh, desperate for anything that might delay death, even if it can't prevent it entirely, asks where this plant grows. Utnapishtim tells him it's at the bottom of the ocean, deep beneath the waves where no normal human could reach it. But Gilgamesh is not normal. He's 2/3 divine and driven by desperate need. He ties stones to his feet to weigh himself down and descends to the ocean floor, walking along the bottom until he finds the plant. The plant has sharp thorns that cut his hands as he plucks it, drawing blood and causing pain. But Gilgamesh doesn't care. He has found something, not immortality, but at least a way to delay aging, to push death back even if he cannot escape it entirely. He surfaces with the plant clutched in his bleeding hands and begins the long journey back to Uruk with Urshanabi. But crucially, Gilgamesh doesn't use the plant immediately. Despite his terror of death and aging, he has learned some caution, some doubt. He doesn't trust that the plant works as promised. He decides to take it back to Uruk and test it on an old man first, to make sure it truly has the power to restore youth before risking it on himself. This decision, prudent and reasonable, will prove to be his undoing. On the journey back, Gilgamesh and Urshanabi stop at a pool of clear water so Gilgamesh can bathe and refresh himself. He leaves the plant on the shore, thinking it's safe there for the few minutes he'll be in the water. But a serpent, attracted by the plant's fragrance, slithers out from the reeds. The snake eats the plant and immediately sheds its old skin, emerging renewed and young again. This is why snakes can shed their skins and appear reborn according to the myth, because they stole the rejuvenation that was meant for humanity. Gilgamesh emerges from his bath to find the plant gone and the snake's discarded skin lying on the shore, mocking evidence of what he's lost. For a moment he cannot comprehend what has happened. Then understanding crashes over him, and he falls to his knees weeping. "For whom have I laboured?" he cries. "For whom have I journeyed? For whom have I suffered? I have gained absolutely nothing for myself. I have only profited the snake, the ground lion. Everything he has endured, all the grief and terror and impossible journeys, the crossing of the waters of death, the meeting with Utnapishtim, the descent to the ocean floor, the bleeding hands from the thorns, all of it was for nothing. He's still mortal. He will still die, and now he doesn't even have the plant that might have delayed that death. He has failed completely and utterly. There is no escape from mortality. The god's decree is absolute. But something shifts in Gilgamesh during the journey back to Uruk after losing the plant. The texts don't spell this out explicitly, but show it through his actions and words. He has been changed by his failures, by his encounter with Utnapishtim, by the loss of the plant. He's learned something profound about mortality and meaning that he couldn't have learned any other way. When he finally reaches home, exhausted and empty-handed, he sees his city with new eyes. He looks at the walls of Uruk, the great walls that he built or restored, walls that will stand for generations. He sees the temples and streets and civilization he helped create, and in that moment, Gilgamesh finds a different kind of immortality than the one he had been seeking. He cannot live forever in body. The gods decreed mortality for all humans, and that decree is absolute, but his works will endure. His name will be remembered. The walls of Uruk will stand as testament to his greatness long after his body has turned to dust. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing these walls to Ushabti, the ferryman who helped him cross the waters of death and who has returned with him to the mortal world. He speaks with pride about the walls, about how they were constructed, about the bricks fired in kilns to withstand time, about the foundations laid by the 7 sages in patterns of geometric perfection. He describes how the walls encompassed not just the city, but also orchards and clay pits, a complete civilization within their circuit. 1 league city, 1 league palm gardens, 1 league lowlands, the open area of the Ishtar temple, 3 leagues and the open area of Uruk it encloses. This is Gilgamesh's immortality, not escaping death, but creating something that outlasts death, not living forever, but being remembered forever. The walls of Uruk did stand for centuries after Gilgamesh died. His name was remembered for millennia, passed down through oral tradition and written texts. The epic itself, inscribed on tablets 4,000 years ago, ensures that we still know his story today. In failing to achieve immortality, Gilgamesh achieved something more meaningful and more real. This conclusion represents the mature Sumerian understanding of mortality and meaning. Gilgamesh began his quest believing that death was something to be defeated, an enemy to be overcome through strength or cleverness. He thought that because one human, Utnapishtim, had achieved immortality, perhaps it was possible for others as well. He couldn't accept that mortality was simply the human condition, decreed by the gods from creation and inescapable. But through his journey and his failures, Gilgamesh learned what the Sumerians understood about death. Fighting against it is futile. The gods decreed mortality for humanity, and that decree cannot be changed or circumvented, except in the rarest exceptional cases that prove the rule rather than establishing precedent. Utnapishtim's immortality was a one-time divine gift that will never be repeated. Every other human, no matter how great or wise or strong, must face the death that was ordained at creation. However, accepting mortality doesn't mean despair or meaninglessness. It means finding different paths to significance, different forms of immortality, legacy through works that endure, memory in the minds of those who come after, accomplishments that benefit future generations, children who carry your name, stories that preserve your deeds. These forms of immortality are real and achievable, available to anyone who creates something worthy of remembrance. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself becomes a kind of immortality for the king whose story it tells. Whether or not a historical Gilgamesh actually lived and ruled Uruk 3,000 years before Christ, the literary Gilgamesh has achieved eternal life through the story. 4,000 years after these tablets were inscribed, we still read his story, still moved by his grief for Enkidu, still understanding his terror of death, still appreciating his final acceptance of mortality. The scribes who wrote these tablets understood this paradox perfectly. The epic frames itself as Gilgamesh's own account, inscribed on the stone tablets that he placed by the gates of Uruk, telling future generations about his failed quest for immortality. By writing it down, by preserving the story, Gilgamesh achieved the very thing he sought, a life that transcends death. Not physical immortality, but something arguably more meaningful. Immortality through memory and story and continued relevance to the human condition. This brings us full circle to the question we began with tonight. When did death enter the world according to the Sumerians? The answer, as we've seen through all these texts and myths, is clear and consistent. Death entered the world at the moment humanity was created. When Enki and Ninhursag mixed clay with divine blood to form the first humans, when breath entered those clay forms and they became living beings, death was already part of their nature. Mortality wasn't something that happened to humanity later through sin or accident. It was decreed from inception, woven into the very fabric of what makes us human. But death's presence intensified after the flood. The population control measures instituted by Enki and Nintu made death more active, more present throughout human life from birth onward. Infant mortality, barrenness, shortened lifespans, disease, these became constant features of human existence in ways they perhaps hadn't been before. Death moved from being an eventual fate to being an ever-present reality throughout life. The Sumerian tablets reveal something profound about how consciousness of death shaped their entire civilization. They didn't hide from mortality or pretend it didn't exist. They faced it directly, incorporated it into their religious practices, their literature, their daily lives. The cult of the dead was central to Sumerian society precisely because they understood that death didn't end relationships or obligations. The dead remained present in the underworld, aware of what happened above, capable of affecting the living for good or ill depending on how they were treated. This integration of death into life created a culture that valued memory and legacy above almost everything else. What mattered wasn't how long you lived, since everyone's lifespan was limited by divine decree. What mattered was what you accomplished during your time, how well you were remembered after you were gone, whether your name continued to be spoken by descendants and strangers alike. This drove Sumerian kings to build monuments, to inscribe their deeds on stone and clay, to create works that would endure beyond their mortal lives. The influence of Sumerian thought about death extended far beyond ancient Mesopotamia, shaping the religious and philosophical traditions that came after. When the Akkadians conquered Sumer around 2300 BCE, they adopted and adapted Sumerian mythology wholesale, translating texts into their Semitic language but keeping the core theological ideas intact. The Atrahasis epic, our primary source for understanding Sumerian views on mortality, survives primarily in Akkadian versions that preserved and elaborated on earlier Sumerian traditions. The Babylonians and Assyrians who followed continued this pattern. They revered Sumerian as a classical language of scholarship and religion, much as medieval Europeans revered Latin. Scribal schools taught Sumerian for over 2,000 years after it ceased to be a living spoken language. Students copied Gilgamesh tablets as writing exercises, ensuring the epic's preservation and transmission across generations. The stories evolved, details changed, new elements were added, but the fundamental understanding of mortality remained consistent. Most significantly for us today, Sumerian ideas about death clearly influenced the Hebrew Bible, and through it, the entire Judeo-Christian tradition. The parallels are undeniable and have been recognized by biblical scholars since the 19th century discovery and translation of Mesopotamian texts. The flood story in Genesis bears unmistakable similarities to the Sumerian and Akkadian versions, with Noah filling the role of Zeus-Sudra or Atrahasis. The creation of humanity from dust in Genesis echoes the Sumerian creation from clay and divine blood. The Hebrew concept of Sheol, the underworld where all the dead reside regardless of righteousness or wickedness, closely resembles the Sumerian Kur. Early Hebrew tradition, like Sumerian thought, didn't have concepts of heaven and hell as places of reward and punishment, but rather a single dark realm where everyone went after death. The Psalms and other biblical texts describe Sheol in terms that would be familiar to any Sumerian, as a place of dust and darkness where the dead praise God no more because they exist in diminished shadowy form. Even the biblical lifespan of 120 years, mentioned in Genesis as the limit God set after the flood, appears in the Atrahasis epic as the maximum lifespan decreed by the gods after they decided to make death more active in preventing overpopulation. The pattern of humanity multiplying, disturbing the divine realm, being punished with disaster, and surviving through divine mercy appears in both traditions. The fundamental structure of these narratives is too similar to be coincidental. Of course, there are significant differences between Sumerian and biblical traditions. The biblical writers transformed the polytheistic Mesopotamian myths into monotheistic theology, replacing the pantheon of gods with a single creator deity. They added moral and ethical dimensions that weren't present in Sumerian thought, making death a punishment for sin rather than a practical population control measure. Over time, especially in later Jewish and Christian theology, ideas about resurrection, final judgment, heaven and hell would develop that directly contradicted the Sumerian acceptance of mortality as absolute and unchangeable. But the underlying questions remain the same. Why do we die? What happens after death? How should we live knowing we're going to die? What gives meaning to a life that must end? The Sumerian answers to these questions, preserved on clay tablets 4,000 years ago, continued to resonate and influence how subsequent cultures thought about mortality, even when those cultures developed different theological frameworks for understanding death. The rediscovery of Sumerian texts in the 19th century caused considerable excitement and controversy in both scholarly and religious circles. Here was proof that the biblical flood story wasn't unique, that creation myths featuring clay and divine breath existed long before Genesis, that sophisticated theological thinking about mortality predated Jewish and Christian scripture by millennia. Some saw this as threatening to religious faith, suggesting that the Bible had borrowed from earlier pagan sources rather than representing unique divine revelation. Others saw it as enriching our understanding of how ancient peoples across different cultures grappled with fundamental questions of existence. The debates continue today among biblical scholars, theologians, and historians. But regardless of one's religious perspective, the Sumerian tablets remain as physical evidence of humanity's long meditation on death and meaning, preserved accidentally by fires that baked clay harder rather than destroying it, recovered through patient archaeological excavation, deciphered through scholarly dedication. Reading these texts in the 21st century, we're struck by how modern they feel in some respects. The Sumerian acceptance of mortality is inevitable, the focus on creating lasting works rather than seeking impossible immortality, the emphasis on love and relationships despite their temporary nature. These ideas resonate with contemporary secular humanist thought. Gilgamesh's journey from denial of death to acceptance and finding meaning in legacy mirrors psychological processes that modern people still experience when confronting mortality. At the same time, we've lost something that the Sumerians possessed. They had a clear cosmological framework that explained why death exists and what happens after. They could point to tablets that recorded divine decrees about mortality. They knew exactly what the underworld was like because their myths described it consistently. They understood their place in the cosmic order as beings created to serve gods, mortal by divine decree, destined for the cure but capable of achieving immortality, through memory and accomplishment. Modern people, especially in secular contexts, often lack this kind of certainty. We know we'll die because biology and medicine tell us so, but we don't have a clear explanation for why death exists or what, if anything, comes after. We understand mortality as a biological fact, but struggle to find meaning and purpose within mortal constraints. The Sumerian framework, whether we believe it or not, at least provided answers and a coherent worldview within which to understand death. There's also something valuable about how the Sumerians integrated death into their daily lives rather than hiding it away. They maintained ancestor shrines in their homes, making regular offerings to the dead. They told stories about the underworld, teaching children from an early age what happened after death. They performed elaborate funeral rites that involved the whole community. Death wasn't sanitized or removed from view, but rather acknowledged as a natural part of life's cycle, something everyone would eventually experience. Modern Western culture, by contrast, tends to isolate death in hospitals and funeral homes, to avoid talking about it directly, to treat mortality as something uncomfortable and inappropriate for polite conversation. This denial might actually make death harder to accept when it comes to ourselves or our loved ones. The Sumerians' more direct engagement with mortality, their willingness to face it squarely and incorporate it into daily existence, might have made the inevitable easier to bear. The tablets also demonstrate the power of writing itself as a form of immortality, a point that would not have been lost on the scribes who laboriously inscribed these texts. The Sumerians invented writing around 3000 BCE for practical purposes, recording grain stores and commercial transactions. But they quickly realized that writing could preserve not just numbers but stories, prayers, wisdom, names. The scribe who carved Gilgamesh's story onto clay tablets 4,000 years ago achieved his own immortality even though we don't know his name. His work survives, still moving readers millennia after his death. This is perhaps the deepest irony and the most profound truth in all the Sumerian meditation on mortality. They wrote that death was ordained for all humans, that immortality was impossible, that we must accept our temporary existence. But by writing these thoughts on clay tablets, by preserving them for future generations to read and ponder, they achieved exactly the kind of immortality they said was unattainable. Not physical immortality, not eternal life in body, but something arguably more meaningful. Immortality through ideas, through stories, through the transmission of wisdom across vast expanses of time. When we read the Atrahasis epic today and encounter the moment when Enki decreed death for humanity, we're connecting directly with Sumerian thought from over 4,000 years ago. The physical body of the scribe who wrote that particular line is long since dust, scattered and recycled through countless other organisms, but his words live on, teaching and challenging us still. The kings he may have served are forgotten, their names lost to time. But the stories he preserved continue to resonate because they address eternal questions that every generation must face anew. Thank you for joining me on this exploration tonight. If you found value in this journey through ancient Sumerian thought about death and mortality, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating content about the fascinating stories and wisdom of ancient civilizations. Let me know in the comments what resonated with you, what surprised you, or what other ancient cultures and topics you'd like us to explore together. Until next time, remember that we're all walking the same path the ancient Sumerians walked, from creation to death, and what matters is what we build along the way.